Elon Musk received an email with a simple subject line, "Invitation to the Bryant Palmer Show." At first, he only glanced at it. Invitations like this came in daily. From news programs, tech conferences, to television interviews, most of them he declined. But Bryant Palmer was different. Palmer wasn't just a talk show host, he was a phenomenon. His show had millions of viewers tuning in every night, not just for the guests, but for Palmer himself, a man famous for his sharp, provocative interviews, unafraid to humiliate his guests on live television. He had made politicians stammer, CEOs lose their composure, and Hollywood stars sit in awkward silence before the public. Musk knew that. He knew Palmer would try to turn the interview into a spectacle, a battle of wits where most guests walked away defeated. But Musk had never been one to shy away from a challenge. After considering for a moment, he looked at his assistant and said simply, "Set it up." On the day of the interview, Musk walked into the studio with the calm demeanor of a man who had witnessed rockets explode on the launch pad, factories teeter on the edge of collapse, and the worst moments of the tech industry. As he sat in the green room, a large screen played highlights of Palmer's past interviews. Guests flustered, angry, or rendered speechless under Palmer's relentless questioning. Musk merely smiled. He knew he was about to step into a battle, but the real question was, who would truly end up in the hot seat? As the studio doors swung open, Elon Musk stepped onto the stage, the spotlight shining directly on him and Bryant Palmer as they prepared to face off. In the audience, hundreds of spectators watched with anticipation and curiosity. Some were devoted Musk fans, others were skeptics, and the rest had likely come just to witness the inevitable drama. They knew Palmer, he didn't just interview his guests, he turned every conversation into a public interrogation. Palmer was already seated behind his desk, flipping through his cue cards, before looking up with a calculated grin. "Elon," he said, standing up and extending a hand. "Glad you could join us." Musk shook his hand firmly, his expression calm, but he didn't miss the faint smirk on Palmer's lips, a clear sign that the host was already setting the stage for an unforgiving match. Once they were seated, Palmer turned to the audience, raising his hand for effect. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a very special guest, the man behind Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and a dozen other crazy projects I can't even name. Some call him a genius, others think he's insane. So, what's the truth? Let's hear it from Elon Musk himself." The audience clapped, but in that applause was a mix of excitement and expectation. They knew Palmer never asked a question without an agenda. Palmer leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Elon, what do you think you are? A genius or a madman?" Musk gave a faint smile, unfazed by the first provocation. "I think history will decide that." Palmer nodded, but a sharp glint appeared in his eyes. "Safe answer. But we're not here to talk about history. Let's talk about the present. You're building electric cars, launching rockets, implanting chips in people's brains. Some say you're playing God. What do you say to that?" The audience gasped at the loaded question, but Musk didn't flinch. He simply shrugged. "If I were really playing God, I'd at least make sure my rockets didn't explode." The room erupted in laughter, but Palmer wasn't about to let humor derail his attack. He picked up another cue card, glancing at it with a knowing smirk. "Right, but seriously, Ellen," he pressed. "You have more money than entire countries. People worship you like a tech messiah. Do you ever stop and think, maybe I'm going too far, maybe I should slow down before I become the next James Bond villain?" The audience chuckled, but there was something in Palmer's tone, something more pointed than playful. He wasn't just joking, he was baiting. Musk nodded slightly, pretending to ponder. "If I were a villain, I think I'd at least have a secret lair by now. But unfortunately, I still live in a $50,000 house in Texas." More laughter, but Palmer wasn't giving up. He flipped through another card, feigning surprise. Speaking of that house, didn't you just fire most of the janitorial staff at X? Is that true?" Musk remained composed. "We had to make some adjustments." Palmer seized the moment. Adjustments is an interesting way to say you left people jobless right before the holidays, wouldn't you say? The room fell into a hush. The laughter had vanished, replaced by a charged silence filled with curiosity and tension. Palmer was no longer interviewing, he was challenging, and this was only the beginning. The shift in the studio atmosphere was undeniable. The scattered chuckles had faded, replaced by an anticipatory hush. Bryant Palmer had just delivered a hard-hitting blow, and every pair of eyes in the audience was now fixed on Musk, waiting to see how he would respond. Elon Musk remained still, his expression unreadable. Slowly he nodded, as if carefully weighing Palmer's words before replying in a voice both measured and sharp. "I assume you're referring to the San Francisco office?" Palmer smirked, as if he had just caught his prey. "That's right." He leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Reports say employees were crying when they found out they were laid off. Meanwhile, you're sitting on a fortune worth hundreds of billions. That doesn't seem very fair, does it?" A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement. Musk, as always, didn't rush to respond. He let the tension linger for a few seconds before calmly stating, "You know, running a company isn't about making everyone happy, it's about keeping it alive." Palmer raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, all are wildly successful. You can't say you don't have enough money to keep those employees." Musk tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Your show airs every week, doesn't it?" Palmer frowned slightly, unsure where Musk was taking the conversation. "Yes, and?" Musk leaned in, his voice lower, heavier. "So I assume that if your network decided to cut jobs to optimize profits, you'd voluntarily take a pay cut to keep them employed?" The room fell silent. Palmer blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly regained his composure. "That's not the same, Elon." Musk smiled, not in mockery, but as a quiet warning. "That's fine. I'm simply pointing out the reality that running a business requires tough decisions, and I'm certain even you are not immune to that reality." Palmer gripped his cue cards a little tighter but maintained his confidence. He pivoted the conversation. "All right, Elon, let's talk about something that everyone cares about. Tesla. Self-driving accidents." A few audience members took a deep breath, sensing that Palmer had just locked onto another potential weak spot. "Your self-driving cars have been involved in several serious accidents. People have lost their lives, yet you continue to promote it as the future. Do you feel responsible?" Musk crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Do you know how many car accidents happen in the U.S. every day?" Palmer shook his head. "Enlighten me." Musk leaned forward. "Over 100 people die every day, and no one asks the CEO of Ford or Toyota to come on television and answer for every single accident." A small round of applause echoed from a corner of the audience. Palmer smirked, but the smugness in his eyes had dimmed slightly. "But Ford doesn't promise a fully self-driving car, you do." Musk nodded slightly. "Exactly. And that's why we're still in beta. The technology is evolving, but compared to human drivers, it has already demonstrated a significant reduction in accidents." Palmer inhaled deeply, realizing that Musk wasn't as easy to corner as his previous guests. But he still had more cards to play. Flipping through one quickly, he smiled knowingly. "Fantastic. Then let's talk about Neuralink. You want to put chips in people's brains. Nobody's talking about that?" This time there were scattered chuckles from the audience, but they weren't relaxed laughter. They carried a nervous edge. Musk's expression didn't change, but inside he knew the psychological game was far from over. Palmer wouldn't stop. But what Palmer didn't know was that neither would Musk. Palmer leaned forward, his eyes gleaming like a predator who had just caught the scent of blood. He flipped through his cue cards, as if preparing to deliver his strongest blow yet. "Let's talk about Neuralink," Palmer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You want to implant chips into human brains, control thoughts, turn people into living machines? Sounds more like the plot of a dystopian horror film, doesn't it?" The audience laughed, but it wasn't the laughter of amusement. It was the uneasy laughter of people who weren't entirely sure if Palmer was exaggerating. Musk slowly folded his arms, his eyes razor-sharp. He had seen this tactic before, the way Palmer manipulated the crowd, planted doubts, distorted facts to craft a sensational narrative. But Musk wasn't going to fall into that trap. "Bryant," Musk said, his voice calm but weighty, "you've been watching too many Hollywood movies." The audience chuckled, but Palmer wasn't fazed. He pressed on. "Right, but let's be serious, Elon," Palmer smirked. "What about privacy, the risk of hackers, the possibility of governments using this technology for control?" Musk nodded slightly, as if considering the question, then spoke slowly. "I think those concerns are valid, but there's something interesting." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "People say I have too much power. But who really holds power? A person creating technology in the open, or those sitting behind the scenes, deciding what you're allowed to ask me right now?" The air grew heavy. Palmer's confident smirk faltered just for a fraction of a second. Musk had done something no one expected. He wasn't defending. He was attacking. "You want to talk about control?" Musk continued, his voice steady, sharp as a blade. "Let's talk about your own industry. Who really decides what gets broadcasted here?" Palmer froze. It was no longer Musk under interrogation. It was Palmer who was now in the hot seat. The studio fell into an uneasy stillness, like a taut rope about to snap. Palmer, a man who was always in control, suddenly found himself on the defensive. The audience, who had been laughing along moments ago, now watched Musk with newfound intrigue. Palmer shifted slightly in his seat, a subtle movement, but Musk caught it. Palmer knew that if he let Musk take control, the entire interview would slip through his fingers, so he quickly countered. "Elon, don't dodge the question," Palmer said, his voice regaining its edge. "I'm not the one running a massive social media platform, deciding who gets to speak and who gets silenced. You talk about power, but aren't you one of the most powerful people on the planet?" Musk didn't blink. He let the question hang in the air for a few seconds before responding, his voice calm but firm. "If you're really concerned about power, then ask yourself, who controls what's allowed on television right now?" The audience went silent. Some exchanged glances, a few nodded in agreement. Musk wasn't just answering questions. He was flipping the entire game on its head. Palmer chuckled dryly, but it lacked his usual confidence. He quickly flipped to another cue card, then looked up with a challenging glare. "All right, then let's talk about the lawsuit against Tesla for racial discrimination. Employees have come forward saying they were subjected to slurs, unfair treatment, inside your own company. How does a man who wants to take humanity to Mars allow this to happen right here on Earth?" A hard hit. Palmer knew this was a sensitive topic. He expected Musk to fumble, or at least show hesitation. But Musk simply looked at him, his gaze cold, and replied, "You want to talk about lawsuits, fine, but let's talk about your own network first." The words hit like a thunderclap. Palmer blinked rapidly, but he couldn't hide his unease. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," he said, but his voice had lost some of its usual sharpness. Musk leaned forward, his gaze razor-sharp. "You work for a network that has been sued for spreading misinformation, haven't you? Your show is funded by pharmaceutical companies, banks, and even corporations that you pretend to criticize. You want to talk about power and control? Then why don't we discuss the people who really sit behind the chair you're in?" A few small gasps rippled through the audience. They could sense something was shifting. This was no longer an interview. This was a public showdown. Palmer's mouth opened as if to say something, but nothing came out. Throughout his career, he had embarrassed, humiliated, and cornered some of the world's most powerful figures. But now, for the first time, he was the one on the defensive. Bryant Palmer sat frozen in his chair, his fingers unconsciously gripping the cue cards in front of him. He had just realized something he never thought he would experience. He was no longer in control of this interview. The air in the studio grew thick with tension. The audience, who had initially come expecting to see Elon Musk grilled under Palmer's trademark interrogation, were now witnessing the complete opposite. But Palmer couldn't let this stand. He took a deep breath, flipping through his cue cards, desperately trying to regain the upper hand. "Very clever, Elon," Palmer said with a forced chuckle, but everyone could hear the strain in his voice. "But this isn't about me. This is about you. People say you run X like a dictator. You decide who gets to speak, who gets banned. You talk about free speech, yet you control it however you see fit. So who's really manipulating information?" Musk remained calm. He let the question hang in the air for a moment before responding, his voice low but cutting. "So what you're saying is, I have too much power?" Palmer's eyes gleamed with a flicker of hope. Musk tilted his head slightly, his piercing gaze locked onto Palmer. "If power is the issue, then let's talk about the people who truly have power. The ones sitting behind the scenes deciding what you can or cannot ask me right now. The ones funding your show. Do they want you to be asking me these questions?" Silence swallowed the room. A few audience members exchanged glances, a couple of them nodding. Palmer opened his mouth, but for the first time in the entire interview, no words came out. Musk didn't stop. "You say I control information? Then ask yourself, who really controls the information people receive every day? I build companies that anyone can see, evaluate, and criticize. But you work within a system where people only see the surface. So tell me, who's really hiding the truth?" A round of applause erupted from a corner of the audience. This time, Palmer couldn't ignore it. He glanced down at his cue cards, but now they were nothing more than meaningless scraps of paper. Musk didn't need to say anything else. He had won, not by dodging the questions, but by exposing the entire game, and more importantly, the audience knew it. The studio remained engulfed in thick silence. Bryant Palmer sat there, staring at his cue cards, realizing the brutal truth. He hadn't just lost the argument, he had lost control of his own show. Musk leaned back slightly, unhurried. He didn't need to press further. He had not only dismantled Palmer's attacks, but had flipped the entire narrative. The audience was no longer just listening to Palmer's questions. They were questioning him, his show, and the forces truly dictating the information they consumed. Palmer struggled to regain ground. He cleared his throat, flipping through his cards, desperately searching for a final strike that could salvage the interview. But even he knew the tide had turned. "All right, Elon." Palmer forced a smile, his voice missing its usual confidence. "I think we should wrap up this interview on a positive note. Can you tell us what's next? What does the future hold for humanity?" Musk looked at him, recognizing the attempt to shift the conversation into neutral ground. But instead of playing along, he decided to deliver the final blow. "The future isn't just about technology," Musk said slowly. "It's about truth. The biggest problem in the world isn't AI, isn't electric cars, isn't space travel. It's trust. People don't trust governments anymore. They don't trust the media. They don't trust the people who are supposed to tell them the truth." Another silence gripped the studio. Palmer swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the audience, realizing that he had lost them. And then, one person clapped, then another, then 5. Then the entire room erupted in applause. Palmer stiffened, knowing that this interview wouldn't be remembered for the questions he asked, but for how Musk completely dismantled his tactics on live television. The aftermath. The moment the show ended, social media exploded. Clips of Musk turning the tables spread like wildfire. On X, formerly Twitter, a viral post read, "Elon Musk just made Bryant Palmer the subject of his own interview." It gained millions of interactions within an hour. Backstage, Palmer yanked off his earpiece and slammed it onto the desk. An assistant walked in, phone screen glowing with notifications. "Bryant, you might want to see this." But Palmer didn't need to look. He already knew. He had lost. The meeting at the network. Bryant Palmer strode into the boardroom of the network headquarters, trying to maintain an air of composure. But the executive seated before him could see the tension in his posture. A massive screen at the front of the room displayed real-time audience reactions. Everyone was watching the aftermath unfold. A woman in a navy suit, clearly one of the top decision-makers, set her phone down. Engagement is at an all-time high. Palmer forced a small smile, grasping for a silver lining. See, we created a viral TV moment. But the executive across from him didn't smile back. He simply shook his head, his voice measured but cold. The problem, Bryant, is that it's not going in our favor. Palmer blinked. I don't understand. We have millions of views, don't we? The woman crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. Yes, but the conversation is turning against us. She gestured toward the screen, where headlines flashed. Elon Musk flips the script, exposes media hypocrisy on live TV. Brian Palmer gets a taste of his own medicine and it backfires. Public trust in media crumbles further after Musk's brutal takedown. Palmer felt his throat go dry. He looked around the room, noticing the executive's expressions had changed. One of them exhaled. Bryant, what worries us isn't just this interview. It's the bigger shift happening. The public is questioning the way we operate. They don't see interviews like this as journalism anymore. They see them as scripted theater. Palmer crossed his arms, trying to mask his frustration. This will blow over. The public has a short memory. They'll forget. A long pause. The woman in the navy suit studied Palmer carefully before responding in a quiet but pointed tone. Maybe, or maybe this time, the real takeaway. While Bryant Palmer was left facing damage control at his network, Elon Musk sat in a quiet office, a half-finished cup of coffee beside him. The screen in front of him glowed with millions of social media posts. The interview, less than 24 hours old, had already become a media firestorm. But one particular post caught his attention. It wasn't from a journalist or a political analyst, just a regular person who had watched the interview and summed it up in one chilling sentence. The scariest thing about last night wasn't what Musk said. It was realizing how badly the media tries to control the narrative. Musk smirked slightly. That was the real story. The debate was no longer about whether Musk had fired employees, whether he held too much power, or whether Neuralink was something to fear. It had evolved into a deeper conversation about how the media operates, how it shapes information, manipulates public perception, and most importantly, how the audience was beginning to see through it. In the network's boardroom, Palmer was still trying to defend himself. He argued that this would all blow over soon, that the media could still steer the narrative in their favor. But a senior executive simply shook his head, his voice calm but razor-sharp. The issue isn't just this story, Bryant. The issue is that the audience has seen the strings pulling the puppet. And that was something Palmer could no longer control, because once the public starts asking questions, they don't stop. Musk set his phone down, his expression thoughtful. He knew that public opinion would continue to shift, that one day the tide might turn against him too, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that a crack had formed in the media's carefully constructed facade, and once a crack is visible, it never truly disappears. Because once you see the strings controlling the puppet, you can never look at the show the same way again. In today's world where media narratives are carefully constructed, the story of Elon Musk's interview with Bryant Palmer serves as a powerful lesson in critical thinking and media literacy. The way Musk turned the tables on Palmer exposed a harsh reality. Much of what we consume as news is not just information, but a crafted performance designed to manipulate public perception. The lesson here is clear: always question the narrative. Just because something is widely reported does not mean it is objective or complete. We live in an era where social media and traditional news outlets compete for attention, often prioritizing sensationalism over truth. Learning to recognize bias, fact-check claims, and seek multiple perspectives is crucial. Another takeaway is the importance of composure and strategic thinking when facing pressure. Musk didn't react emotionally. Instead, he remained calm, dissected the questions, and redirected the conversation. This is a skill we can all apply in life, whether in debates, negotiations, or simply handling criticism. Finally, never underestimate the power of truth. Once people recognize manipulation, their trust erodes. In a world where control is often exerted through information, those who think independently and seek truth will always have the upper hand.